Good evening. Let's start with the lie that sits at the center of almost every modern war. The lie is that control belongs to the side with the biggest military, the deepest pockets, the loudest media, and the most polished officials standing behind podiums. That is the lie. Because in modern conflict, control is never just about bombs, ships, or satellites. Control is about narrative. Control is about whether a government can make reality obey its story. And the moment reality stops obeying the script, power starts to crack. That is the scenario I want to lay out tonight, not the collapse of a country on the battlefield, not the sudden defeat of an empire in one dramatic week, but something slower, more dangerous, and in many ways more humiliating, a great power losing command of the story it told its own people, because that is where strategic failure often begins. A superpower enters conflict with enormous confidence. It says the mission will be limited. It says the goals are clear. It says the targets are precise. It says escalation is under control. It says the enemy is isolated, weakened, irrational, exposed. It says the public should trust the experts, trust the process, trust the timetable. And at first, that story works. Why? Because power always looks convincing in the opening act. Missiles launch, maps light up. Commentators use words like decisive, calibrated, measured, and overwhelming. Officials speak in calm tones. Anchors repeat the language. Allies issue statements. Markets wobble, then steady. The state projects confidence, and confidence itself becomes part of the weapon. But then the first crack appears. The enemy is still there. The leadership that was supposed to collapse is still speaking. The infrastructure that was supposed to break is still functioning in fragments. The population that was supposed to panic is still resisting. The region that was supposed to stabilize is getting more volatile. And the conflict that was supposed to remain narrow begins to spread beyond the clean borders of the original promise. This is where narrative warfare becomes more important than battlefield warfare, because now the question is no longer just what happened. The question becomes who gets to explain what happened. A superpower in this situation has a problem it does not like to admit. It does not merely need military success. It needs military success that fits the public story it already sold. And that is a far harder thing to achieve. If the war was advertised as quick, it cannot become endless. If it was sold as defensive, it cannot start looking reckless. If it was presented as stabilizing, it cannot visibly multiply chaos. If it was justified as necessary, it cannot begin to look optional, improvised, or ideological. Once those contradictions pile up, the state enters a dangerous phase. It begins managing appearances more aggressively than outcomes. That is the pivot. At this stage, every briefing becomes less about truth and more about containment. Language becomes softer as facts become harsher. Civilian suffering becomes collateral. Retreat becomes redeployment. Failure becomes complexity. Stalemate becomes long-term pressure. The absence of victory becomes strategic patience. And this is where the illusion of control starts rotting from the inside, because propaganda is strongest when reality is still somewhat cooperative. It is weakest when ordinary people can see the gap between the promise and the result. That gap is fatal. The public was promised order. They see drift. They were promised deterrence. They see retaliation. They were promised precision. They see destruction with no clear political end. They were promised strength. They begin to sense improvisation, anxiety, and spin. Once a population starts feeling that gap, trust does not collapse all at once. It decays in layers. First, people doubt the timeline. Then they doubt the objectives. Then they doubt the messengers. And eventually they doubt the entire logic of the war. That is how narrative authority dies. Now let's sharpen the point. A weaker state fighting a superpower does not always need to dominate the information space globally. It does not need to outspend major media systems. It does not need prettier graphics or better spokespeople. It only needs to do one devastating thing. It needs to keep surviving long enough to make the stronger side look dishonest. That is the whole game. As long as the weaker side remains standing, the superpower's original script starts collapsing under its own weight. If the enemy was supposedly on the verge of breaking, why is the war expanding? If the operation was supposedly limited, why are the costs rising? If the objectives were supposedly clear, why do officials keep redefining success? If escalation was supposedly controlled, why does every week bring a new emergency? This is how the weaker side turns survival into a weapon. It allows the stronger side's own narrative to self-destruct. And once that process begins, the battlefield changes completely. The war is no longer only about territory, firepower, and logistics. It becomes a public trial of credibility. Every official statement is measured against new facts. Every confident promise is haunted by the last one that failed. Every act of escalation looks less like mastery and more like compensation. Every dramatic show of force raises a dangerous question. If things are going so well, why is more force constantly required? That question poisons everything. It poisons press briefings. It poisons alliance politics. It poisons domestic debate. It poisons financial confidence. It poisons military messaging. It poisons the emotional contract between leadership and the public. Because once people suspect they are being managed instead of informed, every new statement sounds thinner than the one before it. And here is where the superpower faces its ugliest temptation to double down on spectacle. When real control weakens, governments often compensate with theatrical control. More flags, more podiums, more dramatic warnings, more slogans, more moral language, more repetition, more efforts to frame doubt itself as disloyalty. But spectacle is not strategy, and repetition is not credibility. In fact, the more visibly a government tries to force the narrative back into obedience, the more obvious its insecurity becomes. The message begins to sound less like confidence and more like pleading backed by hardware. This is when the war begins damaging the stronger side in places the military cannot easily defend. It damages political legitimacy. Leaders who promised competence now look trapped inside their own talking points. Institutions that were supposed to scrutinize power begin echoing it. Media figures who sold certainty begin quietly shifting their language. Allies who publicly stand with the superpower begin privately hedging against the possibility that the strategy is unstable. And meanwhile, the weaker side learns the simplest lesson in asymmetric conflict. Survival is exposure. Every day, it remains functional. It exposes exaggeration. Every retaliatory act exposes failed deterrence. Every sign of internal cohesion exposes false assumptions about collapse. Every month of continued resistance exposes how little the stronger side understood at the beginning. That is why narrative collapse is so dangerous, because once a great power loses control of the meaning of the war, even real tactical successes can stop helping it. A strike may succeed militarily and still fail politically. A target may be destroyed and yet strengthen the enemy's resolve. A speech may reassure supporters for 24 hours and deepen skepticism for the next 24 days. A show of force may frighten some audiences while convincing others that the leadership is escalating because it has run out of cleaner options. This is the hidden weakness of large powers. They do not just fight enemies, they fight expectations. And their own expectations can become a prison. They promised speed. Now time works against them. They promised clarity. Now ambiguity humiliates them. They promised control. Now every surprise becomes an indictment. This is the real meaning of the illusion of control. It is not that power disappears. It is that power becomes harder and harder to translate into believable outcomes. The state still has aircraft. It still has money. It still has reach. But the story connecting those tools to success no longer convinces the audience it matters most. Its own public, its own allies, its own institutions, and the wider world watching for signs of weakness beneath the performance of strength. That is the point where a war becomes corrosive, not because the stronger side has been militarily destroyed, but because it has begun to lose the authority to define what the war is, why it continues, and what victory even means. And once that authority breaks, the damage spreads fast. Support becomes conditional, language becomes evasive, objectives become slippery, escalation becomes habitual, and the leadership starts looking like it is not directing events, but chasing them. That is the moment the public starts sensing what officials will never say out loud. The machine is still powerful, but the script is falling apart. And when the script falls apart, people start seeing the war for what it really is, not a clean expression of control, but a messy exposure of its limits. So the warning in this scenario is simple and brutal. A superpower does not need to lose every battle to lose the war. It may only need to lose its monopoly on explanation. Because once the public stops believing the story, once allies stop trusting the strategy, once every new promise sounds like recycled damage control, then the conflict begins consuming the stronger side from within. That is how narrative failure becomes strategic failure. And that is why the illusion of control is one of the most dangerous illusions any great power can carry into war. Because the moment reality stops following the script, power starts speaking louder but sounding weaker.